So welcome, my friends, to the On the Blue Line podcast with Wayne Mulder. I am your host. This is a law enforcement podcast, and here we discuss topics that will empower you on and off the job. Maybe you're tired, you're frustrated, maybe you're feeling overworked, struggling to find balance with home and work life, or maybe you simply need some encouragement. Then you've come to the right place. Be sure to listen all the way to the end of today's episode. That way you can learn, is technology the problem when it comes to kids? Can any child be a bookworm? And what are guiding family principles? If you're just finding us, welcome. We have two weekly podcasts. The one you're listening to right now is The Interview Room. This is a weekly interview show that releases every Thursday at 0500, and I sit down with guests from all walks of life who can offer us something beneficial that will help us in our personal lives. The other podcast is called Morning Roll Call, which comes out every Monday at 5 o'clock. And that's a weekly monologue show. In there, you and I just sit down. We discuss the news, we discuss current events, law enforcement trends, and a variety of other topics. Here recently, it's all been holiday and Christmas related. That gives you something to consider as you get ready to start your week. Both shows, they're released in almost all podcast platforms, and every episode is available in video on YouTube and Rumble. And the easy way to see everything that's going on is to always just go to On the Blue Line, ontheblueline.com. So, as I mentioned in a couple of the recent episodes, you're going to see some changes. Even this format to the beginning and so forth is going to keep evolving a little bit because I'm working with a marketing company and some others who are hopefully going to help get this podcast to the next level. So hopefully you, because you are the most important component of all this, are enjoying it. And I would love to get your feedback. So definitely be sure to keep in touch with us and just let us know what you think as we continue to evolve to try to bring you the not only best information that's out there, but information that's going to be meaningful and help make a difference in your life. So let me tell you a little bit about this week's guest, this week's interview. It's a little bit of out of left field. However, the goal of this podcast since the very beginning has always been about helping law enforcement officers in their lives outside the job. I know many of my coworkers, they're starting families and have preteen, teen children, little children. So when I heard about this week's guest, I thought, that is an important topic, this whole conversation around technology for parents to at least consider the role of technology in their children's lives. And I know it was a big part of parenting and is, even my son's an adult now, and it's still something that comes up from time to time. So it is an important conversation that I know parents have a lot of questions about. And I thought, well, this is something that certainly could help each and every one of us. The other thing is that here we are, we're 10 days out from Christmas. Yes, I know. 10 days out. If you're listening to this on the day it released, I can't believe it's almost here. And many of the kids will be off for Christmas break. And what better time to start considering some of the principles that this week's guest discusses and the results that she had with her children. So this week's guest is Molly DeFrank. She's the author of Digital Detox, the 2-week tech reset for kids. She helps free families from their addiction to devices. She has a degree in international relations and worked as a press aide for former California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. These days, she's a stay-at-home mom and foster mom to 6 kids ages 12 and under. And let me just get this out front and make sure we're all on the same page. Molly does not dislike technology. She doesn't hate technology. And you're going to see that as we go through this. It really, honestly, what this conversation is all about is getting back to the family being together. And that's the important, overwhelming story to what she tells us. And I know you're going to enjoy it. So without taking any more time, here's this week's guest, Molly DeFrank. Well, Molly, welcome to the show.
Hey, Wayne, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I'm so glad we get to sit down and do this. As I told the listeners in the intro, this is going to be a little different than our typical law enforcement conversations. But I think it is so important because so many of the listeners like myself, we're parents, we've been parents, going to be parents, and this is such an important conversation. So thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me. I have so much respect for our law enforcement community, so it's a privilege to be here.
Well, thank you so much. Well, let's get to the get to know you questions. I do want to tell the listeners what we're going to be discussing today is your book, Digital Detox, the 2-week reset for kids. But before we get to that and all the good stuff that's in there, let's get to the get to know you questions I like to ask my guests. So the difficult one right off the bat, coffee or tea?
Black coffee.
Lots
of it.
That is the right answer. I'm very proud. So do you have a favorite place to have that cup of coffee?
Oh, probably at my dining room table very early in the morning before the kids are awake. Quiet
That
house.
that moment of peace and respite.
Yep. Calm before the storm.
Yes. Do you have a best or worst travel story?
Oh, man. My husband and I try and take a kid-free vacation at least twice a year, just a little weekend getaway. So those are the ones that come to mind. We live in California. I love hitting Santa Barbara. They all sort of morph together in little glimpses of paradise and serenity. We have 6 kids, so
Yes.
they're sort of all lumped together. But yeah, they're best. They're the best ones.
That's awesome. What about a favorite or most meaningful book? Preferably a more modern book, obviously the Bible or some of the more bigger ones up there. But do you have a meaningful book?
Yeah, you know what? We're moving into, my oldest is in junior high right now. We've had teenagers in and out of our home through foster care because we're foster parents. And so the first one that came to mind is one I'm in the middle of reading right now. It's called Feeding the Mouth That Bites You. And it's about parenting teenagers. And it's a really great book. It's awesome. I recommend it.
Perfect. I will definitely have to check that one out. And I'll link it up in the show notes for the listeners as well.
Great.
All right. The last of these type questions. What is your favorite place or the place that brings you the most peace? That favorite spot to stop, breathe, and enjoy life?
I'm going to say the beach.
Okay.
I love being at the beach, watching my kids play, drinking a sparkling water. I love LaCroix, ice cold, hearing the waves. It's the best.
That's perfect. And living here in Florida, I definitely agree with you. I find that question always elicits either the beach or the mountains. That seems to be the two answers to that question. So, Molly, tell us a little bit about yourself. Sounds like you've done some interesting things, like being a press aide, and obviously you have a house full of kids. So, just a little bit about your story and what brought you to this point.
Yeah. Born and raised in Southern California, and went up to college in Northern California where I met David, who would become my husband. And shortly after I got married like a week after we graduated college. And then he went to law school and I worked for Governor Schwarzenegger in his press office, which was a really great experience. Lots of really cool things there. And so I worked for several years and then we started having kiddos and I quit my job after my second was born and stayed home with them. It was a really difficult transition from working to stay at home motherhood, which I know I always wanted to be a stay at home mom, but it was harder than I thought it would be in all of really like very redemptive ways, long term. But, it's hard to see that when you're not getting any sleep and you're changing diapers all day and all that. But fast forward, we had 4 kids in about 5.5 years. And then we became foster parents. We knew we wanted to care for orphans in some capacity. And for us, that looked like opening our home to foster kids. So we've been doing that for about 4 or 5 years. And now we have 6 kids in our home. We have 4 biological kids. We just adopted number 6 back in July. And we are a busy people. So yeah, I wrote this book, Digital Detox, after, for years, I gave my kids these digital devices, electronic entertainment, and the same stuff that I thought that I enjoyed as a kid. I thought, well, yeah, I play video games after school. I love Sonic the Hedgehog, Mario Brothers, Saturday morning cartoons, all of it. And so I thought, well, this is the same. I'm giving it's the for the next generation. And I didn't appreciate how it was different. And I didn't understand why it was bringing out the worst in my kids, why they were arguing next level arguments. And so a couple years ago, 3 years ago, we unplugged all of our kids' digital entertainment and we saw total transformation in our kids. And so since then, I've been helping other families break through from feeling stuck by it, feeling trapped and bogged down by it, to enjoying more connection as a family, finally finding that ideal balance of technology and home. And it's really gratifying, honestly, to help these families. They're all coming back telling me, this changed our life. This changed our home. I'm so glad. So that's what I do now. Mostly the mom thing. And then in the pockets in between, I'm helping other families break free from this.
Which is so important. And I've got tons of questions about the actual process and so forth. A couple more, just some general questions for you. You talk a lot about your faith. Did you grow up in the church then, or?
So I grew up Catholic. I went to Catholic school. My parents went to Catholic school. They raised us. I went through all of the, confirmation, all the sacraments. And In high school, I started going to this church. I don't know if you've heard of Francis Chan.
I have.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, yeah, pretty big deal. Well, his church was getting started in Simi Valley. That's where I grew up. And my brother started going, and, we considered ourselves, our family, kind of religious. We went to church every Sunday. We weren't casual Catholics here. But I watched my brother, this guy, go from like a party animal to, he started going to church. I think he started going to Francis Chan's church because he heard there were cute girls there. And
that is usually a reason guys will start going to church when they become teenagers.
But this crazy thing happened where all of a sudden he started change, like his personality changed in the best way. Like instead of being kind of this punk kid, this party animal, he had like a warmth and like a genuine care about the people around him. He started talking about Jesus. And I'm like, what is going on with this guy? Like, I go to church too. That's not how I'm not like that. My faith doesn't permeate every aspect of my daily living. I don't get it. And so I was asking questions. I started going to that church. I sort of began to understand finally that the gospel is not separate. It's not like a compartmentalized part of my life. It is the foundation. And so that's probably high school is when I think I really understood what Jesus did for me and how that means everything. And that's totally transformed my life. So
I love that.
A little bit of my faith story.
Yeah. And thank you so much for your testimony, because I think that's important. And it's going to feed into some questions I'm going to ask you a little bit later. So the other question I have to ask you before we get into discussing the book, because somebody's thinking it, are you against technology? Do you hate technology, Molly?
No way. I'm so glad you asked me that. I actually, and I only mentioned this in the afterword, but I grew up in Southern California. My dad was a television writer and producer. He wrote, I don't know how old your listeners are, but he actually produced or wrote the movie Back to School with Rodney Dangerfield. That's what brought him out to California in the first place. He grew up in Pittsburgh. But we have a huge respect for not only technology, but digital entertainment. We really enjoy that. My dad's line of work put food on the table and sent me to college. So I have tremendous respect for the power of story and even television. We love good sitcoms. We love watching The Office. We just started introducing that to my junior hire. So there's so many great parts of technology that we get to enjoy. What I found was that too much of it has seeped in over the last couple decades and filled every single gap, every single quiet space, every place where we used to practice boredom as kids. It's all been filled with digital entertainment. And so I found that, and most parents do find that tweaking it every day, taking away some screen time from your kids, adding some back for good behavior, it's not fixing the problems that we're seeing. It's not fixing the tantrums. It's not fixing the sibling fighting. It's not fixing the attention problems at school. And it wasn't until we did something radical that we found the transformation we wanted. And the goal of the book isn't to take it all away forever. It's just to put it in its right place. It's to find the balance that works for you in your home so that tech is working for you. You're not feeling enslaved to it. So that's the whole goal of this process. It's to find that right balance.
Which is awesome. And I think that is exactly the point. And we'll get into it. I've got a little bit more I want to say on that, but I'll get to that here in a second. So how big is the problem? So you did some research for this book. How big is the problem that you're seeing, or can you describe the problem that you're seeing?
Oh yeah, Wayne, it is enormous. So we did our detox before COVID. And some of the research I found was even before COVID hit, we were in the midst of the worst youth mental health crisis we had ever seen. Anxiety, depression through the roof. There is a researcher and professor out at San Diego State. She's been studying trends in generations over the last 60 or so years. And she says the mental health, it's like a tsunami after about 2010, 2011. And she looked through and parsed out, well, what was going on then? Like what happened? And she found that it was the years that more than half of the population had a smartphone as an appendage, that we suddenly had this reliance as a society on these devices. And she went even deeper and saw that, gosh, kids are getting an hour less of face-to-face socialization with peers and friends per day than they used to get just a generation ago. And that is catastrophic to mental health. So this was all happening before COVID hit. Okay. Kids were already struggling. They were already having a hard time. ADHD diagnoses were through the roof compared to before. Kids were struggling. And then COVID happened and everyone was forced online. And so that limited social interaction kids were already having, it was like dumping gasoline on a fire. What we saw during COVID, I know things were probably a lot better in Florida than they were out here in California.
They were a little different, yes.
We've actually had friends move to Florida, so it sounds like a lovely place to live. But, what we saw was that kids' screen time, and I'm just talking digital entertainment. I'm not talking school. I'm not talking texting friends. Digital entertainment doubled for 12-year-olds. So kids went from spending 4 hours a day being digitally entertained to 8 hours a day. That is a full-time job worth of hours on digital entertainment. Now, if this was neutral technology, or if this was like a neutral activity, we could shrug it off, but we know that it's not. We know that it's hurting our kids. And so many parents are looking around going, well, that's what they're doing. I mean, how does my household compare with theirs? And we're comparing it to average, but that's not helpful, because if what other people are seeing in their home is their kids are suffering, we don't want to match that, right? We want to do what's best for our kids. So what I found in researching for the book too, I read stacks of books across disciplines. You read from educators, principals, neurologists, psychiatrists. They are all ringing this alarm. And they have this unique vantage point depending on their discipline. We saw that actually the Wall Street Journal just did a series over the last couple months. Over COVID, ER visits for eating disorders for our 12 to 17-year-old girls doubled. And ER visits for tic disorders. So those are disorders that these girls would come in looking like they have Tourette's. And then they look a little closer, they do these tests, they go, this isn't Tourette's. This is this like social contagion. And they've discovered that the underlying cause is, number one, mental health. And number two, TikTok video exposure, both for the eating disorder issues and the tic disorders. It's exposure to these TikTok videos that our young, impressionable girls are just watching it, and they're mimicking it. So it is wild, and it's hard to overstate the impact that too much and the wrong kind of digital entertainment is having on our kids.
Yeah, it was shocking. And it's one thing that you mentioned that really stood out to me when you talk about this number of hours is that a lot of those figures are not including the number of hours that they're spending at school, where it's more mandated that they're on a computer. In fact, we homeschooled my son, but it was through a program where you pretty much were at the computer all day. So you've got hours of sitting there on top of that. So in some of these estimates, 48 hours, I mean, it's literally 12-hour days, much like, which sadly is my reality. This is kind of one of those things because, yes, it's law enforcement, but in law enforcement, you have computers in every car. And then as a supervisor, you're monitoring your guys and girls all the time and proving reports. And so you're on a computer pretty much all day. And then if you decide you want to run a podcast, you're on a computer all the time and you're editing video and so forth. So when you give those figures and we talk about our kids, that's not including the amount of time that they're at school on screens as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And it is really important to parse this out, because sometimes, you just listed a lot of uses of technology where it is a phenomenal tool for us to use. That's so great that we can connect with each other, for example, from coast to coast live over this computer and these microphones. It's a great use of technology. And yet it can also bog us down. So these are really good conversations to have with our kids that, as you get older, technology can be a wonderful tool. And it can also be really sticky. It's like food. Like food, we eat food as fuel, and we need it. But also, if we're eating dessert for every meal of the day, we're going to feel terrible. Our organs are going to be starving after 10 years. We might look okay if we're staying calorically on point, but on the inside, what's happening on the inside? And with our kids and their brains, it's like, okay, there's an opportunity cost here too. If our kids are spending all their time, if they're spending hours every day numbing out on digital entertainment, what are they not doing? They're not running around outside. They're not going on the swings. They're not having back and forth conversation and pondering life's big questions. Another interesting thing I came across that's actually pretty alarming was occupational therapists are identifying a new condition they're calling virtual autism. And that is a condition that looks like autism in our young kids, but upon closer scrutiny, they'll see it's not actually autism. It's that these kids have been deprived of the sort of play and face-to-face interaction. They've just been numbed out on screen time. So they're not developing the way that they should be. So these are things that parents like me, and I just to clarify, I don't think there's any shame in trying out new technology, especially technology that in the early 2010s was marketed to us. Like, here's how you get your kids ahead. Here's how you create future rocket scientists. The iPad came out in 2011 and it was like, this is what you do. This is the future. This is how to make smart kids. And meanwhile, something I didn't appreciate because I bought in, man, I bought my kids the tablets. I was all about it. Keep them quiet at the restaurants. Meanwhile, the people who are creating this technology, they are the strictest parents when it comes to screen time. Steve Jobs would not let his kids near an iPad. A lot of these creators, the co-founder of Snapchat, he said, "Oh no, I limit my kids' screen time. It kills the imagination." So as parents, I think there's nothing to be ashamed of here. If we've gone down this rabbit hole, we bought into the marketing, we see, wow, that didn't really deliver. I'm seeing some negative effects and you're kind of correcting course. I think that's actually the mark of wisdom and maturity to try something new.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. One more thing I kind of want to bring up in the why portion, only because it really registered with me in my situation, is this whole thing where you talk about the dopamine rush when the whole fight or flight symptoms or that can happen, especially with certain games and especially going to an older. So this was something that I went through with my son. My son's 20 years old now. But as he was an older teenager, becoming a young adult, he loves the games that these young men like, which a lot of them are shooting games, they're military-esque games, which at their face, I don't have an issue with. However, one of the things, and him and I had a sit down conversation about, is there was one particular game that he was playing where it was a shooting type scenario and they were involved in this gunfire and so forth. And then I started watching and I realized that he immediately then played it again and then went it back in and they're back in the shooting scenario and they're back in it and back in it. And I was like, son, you got to understand that I've been in that real life event and a lot of the same body reactions that I went through, I'm seeing in him playing the video game. And yet we go through a debrief cycle afterwards. You talk to people, you know, this doesn't happen every night. Thank God. Years go by, but you still, even thinking about it, go back into it. So I found that fascinating. Could you tell us a little bit about your research and what you saw when you talk about this fight or flight and the dopamine rush?
Yeah, I really appreciate that, what you just shared. That's really interesting. I hadn't really thought about that. But yes, to speak to the dopamine, and this is something I did not know when we detoxed our kids, but in researching for the book, I put in both the practical help and the facts, why it works, what's going on with the dopamine. So here's what I learned. And it's essentially that, the brain is wired to release dopamine, that feel-good chemical, that neurotransmitter, when we experience anything pleasurable. So now our kids' games, their apps, their devices are wired to release excessive amounts of dopamine in the brain. These Silicon Valley engineers have taken what we know about the brain, about dopamine, and they've exploited it and baked it into the devices. I mean, it's essentially the same technology that is used in a casino on those slot machines. It's variable reward systems where, they know that if it varies, like when you get the thing you're looking for, it creates more dopamine, more of a dopamine rush. So that's one of the tactics they use to keep our kids scrolling, tapping, playing. Well, the problem with that is there's such a high amount of dopamine getting released in our kids' brains that dopamine receptors are numbing out. And now we're in this situation where, like any addictive cycle, it takes more dopamine for our kid to experience the same amount of enjoyment, of pleasure that they once used to get from less dopamine. So how does that affect us in real life? Okay. This is why your kids complain of boredom when there's not a screen involved. If you say, go outside and play, take a break from this, go play a puzzle, go talk to the neighbor, and they say, no, that's boring. Okay, it's not entirely their fault. There is a physiological change happening in their brain, and it is making those things feel boring by comparison to their video games. So that's what's going on. It's happening inside. The other thing that you brought up too was the adrenaline, the fight or flight stuff. So when our kids are playing these games, like you mentioned, those first-person shooter games, whatever it is, even the infinite runner games that my kids used to love, they're getting kicked into lots of adrenaline, fight or flight mode. So when you tell that when the screen timer dings, even if you allow another 10 minutes, another 30 minutes, you extend it, you think, okay, this will stave off that tantrum that inevitably follows after the timer goes off. And then you find the timer goes off with the extension of time and they're still falling apart. And you're like, what in the world? Well, it's because they're amped up in fight or flight mode. And those dopamine levels are through the roof. Now the timer dings, the device goes off, you take it away, you're watching a dopamine crash in real time. If you've wondered why your kids, their sibling fights are like next level WWE, that is why they are totally amped up inside those brains. So you're not alone. If you're looking at your kids, you're going, my kids are incredible, wonderful kids, but I'm not seeing the best of them right now. There's something else going on. There's a good chance it's related to their devices.
Yeah, I found that fascinating. And when I read that was one of the biggest takeaways of this book is just looking back over my son growing up and my wife has some older kids and just seeing, these. And what's another thing that was really interesting to me is one thing that your book points out is how these things have changed. Because like you said, there were games. In fact, my dad was a draftsman. And so we always had the newest and best computer in the house. But in the 80s and 90s, like it wasn't the only thing I did. In fact, I laughed out loud when I read in your book talking about quicksand, because much like the comedian has said, being a child of the 80s and 90s, I thought quicksand was going to be a much bigger deal than it's become. Yeah. But it's funny the things we concentrated on compared to what the games and so forth are now. So you start seeing these signs and you decide that you want to go down this detox road. So what did you do? And how did that go over with your husband and with the kids, and kind of take us to that moment?
Yeah. Well, it was several years leading up to this when like I mentioned earlier, I gave my kids all those devices. I enjoyed video gaming as a kid. I enjoyed television as a kid. My parents weren't super strict about it. And so I assumed, this is just the same thing for my kids. And I would always get these nudges over time, like when the screen timer went off, and the kids would melt down. I'm like, wow, they are like zombies. Something else is going on, but life moves quickly. And so we'd move to the next activity and whatever. But the things that I was trying wasn't working. The, 1 to 2 hours a day limits, I was still seeing negative effects, and it bothered me. And it wasn't until I got home one day from running errands, I walked in the door and one of my kids greeted me like this, "Can I play on your phone?" And I'm like, what in the heck? Are you serious? And it put such a bad taste in my mouth that I called my husband. I'm like, hey man, I think we need to pull the plug. I think we just need to go all the way. And he's like, I am so with you. Let's do it. You're the one who's staying home with them. I was homeschooling 2 kids at the time. We had 2 3-year-olds, a new foster placement. It was not, the timing wasn't ideal. If you're waiting for ideal timing, it's not going to come. But I'd had it. And so we told the kids at dinner that night, we're like, hey guys, we love you so much. And we know you love your games. We're going to try something new for a little while. It's not a punishment. We're just going to try this thing. We're going to take all of it away. All the Netflix, all the iPads, all the, video games. We're taking a break. And they lost their minds. There was a lot of crying.
Right. Okay. I can imagine.
It was, my 3 oldest kids, that was their favorite hobbies, each a different video game. And so, you hold your ground as a parent, but on the inside, I'm like, oh no, what have I done? I just signed up for between my husband and I, we looked at the calendar. I'm like, I can hang for 2 weeks. That's all I got in me if they're going to be these kind of tantrums. But we didn't tell the kids it was 2 weeks. It was in mid-February when we started, and we're like, we'll do 2 weeks. And I was terrified after I broke the news to them. I'm like, this is going to be 2 weeks of them crying in my face. How are we going to live? But what actually happened was the opposite. My kids, they woke up the next morning and they started playing with their toys because they knew asking for a screen was not an option. And when they would hit those walls of boredom, they would think of something else to do. And because we made it clear to them, like, do not ask us. If you ask us, that will be annoying to us because we've told you no in advance. So you'll probably just get a chore. So don't ask us. And they didn't. They played with the toys they had. They played with each other. They played for longer, more independently. And it was 2 weeks like that. My kids were calmer. They were more attentive. They got along better. Got more, their creativity exploded. And at the end of the 2 weeks, my husband, David, and I looked at each other and we're like, why would we reintroduce it right now? So we extended our detox longer until we made a long-term plan where we worked the best part back in.
Right. Which I think is the important part. And I love how you did it. Just to clarify for anyone listening to this and is questioning, when you say detox, you're talking everything as far as digital, with maybe the exception of like their school, if they were on some sort of digital device for school, but you're talking television, you're talking social apps, because I'm sure the world we're in right now, people compartmentalize all this stuff. So they're like, well, I detox from social, or I detox from, I don't watch a lot of TV, might be a statement they make, but they're on their phone the same amount of time they used to be on television. So for the purpose of this conversation, when you say detox, you mean everything.
I do. Yes, that's absolutely right. That's a critical part of the detox. That said, the book is really directed at parents of kids up to like 12 or 13. So it's very simple when you have young kids to take all of the digital entertainment off the table. It's pretty clean cut. They don't need a lot of digital. They don't really need any digital entertainment. You might find that if they're going to school, their teachers use digital devices, PowerPoint, whatever in the classroom. That's okay. We did not go into school in March and say, my kid must be exempt from all of your lessons. Like that would be kind of extra. So we didn't do that. But when you're looking at older kids, and there are two main changes you do for older. If you're talking about those like tweens and teens and older, it does get a little trickier. These are kids where the older we get, the world we're living in, devices become a lot more integrated in our lives. And the goal here is not to cut off connection from their friends. It's actually to amp up connection with their friends. So you may need to get creative with those older kids. And also with your younger kids, you can kind of declare a detox. With those older kids, the parent's role has sort of changed from this pure authority figure to mentor and coach kind of. Yeah. It's tapering off as they head out. And that's good. So I recommend that parents, if you've got teens, kind of present this more as like a beckoning, like, hey, we're going to try this challenge. What do you think about that? Tell me this. Have you ever noticed that like you're with your friends, but they're not paying attention to you? Like, how did that make you feel? Kind of whet their appetite for it. Share some of the data with them. Yes. And so kind of invite them. And you can even up the stakes for your older kids by throwing in some cash and saying, let's see if you can make it 2 weeks, I'll pay you $20. It's, like a Biggest Loser type challenge. Make it more fun, more invitational. That said, if your older kids are not on board with this and they're like, yeah, right, crazy person, I am not into that. If I'm talking like 17, 18-year-old, they're kind of making decisions. You could say, okay, that's fine. We're doing this. We're doing it with younger siblings. We also are doing it as a household. And who pays the internet? The router's going off at 6 p.m. So you don't have to participate. It's your choice, but there's money at stake and the Wi-Fi is going off. You know what I mean? So you can kind of make it your own. But those are just some major differences between young kids and older kids.
No, I love it. And I think looking back, which is what I did a lot in your book, I really liked how you go over that, because as one who may or may not have broken an iPhone once of my son's, intentionally, this was a constant battle. And I like the way that you, and battle's maybe not the right word, but I like the way that you define or go through dealing with the older teenagers and some of the ways to set the restrictions or make it more of a challenge, something we can do together, which is going to lead to a different question here in a minute. But something I want to bring up at this point that you mentioned that I think is powerful and really good. And I want everyone to get the book. Again, it's Digital Detox, the 2-week reset for kids. And you're going to have to read the book in order to see everything. But something I want to ask about is you talk about families guiding principles, and you do that early on as kind of how you gear this is coming from those family guiding principles. And I think that's something powerful that a lot of people don't have. In fact, a lot of people don't have life missions. A lot of people don't go down these roads at all. So can you just take us to what you mean by that and what that is?
Yeah, absolutely. The culture that we're living in, it's moving so quickly. We're so inundated with noise and information, and it's easy to just kind of get through the days and without sort of an overarching purpose. So what I like to do is have parents clarify at the beginning of the book, what do we want to accomplish here while our kids are under our roof? What do we want when our kids move out? What do we want them to say were the principles that guided their home? And for us, the example I give is I want our kids to know that we love God and we love people. That's what defines our home. Sometimes we need to sacrifice our own comfort in order to pursue those things. What do you want to impart on your kids? And so when you get that sort of big picture clarity, you can kind of work backwards from there and make sure that your days are are kind of building towards something. It's not going to be perfect. Perfect parenting isn't a thing, unfortunately, for anyone. And I think part of why we've kind of bought into this digital everything, numbing our kids out, is because we bought into this lie that quiet, peaceful, conflict-free is a thing. And it's not. And so we kind of think if we just hand over the device, we get some quiet and everything is fine. If our kids are quiet in their room, they're fine. Well, that's not the world we're living in anymore. If our kids have Wi-Fi access, there are no sensors anymore. When we were growing up, it was like you couldn't access garbage very easily. It's like
Right.
there are some squiggly channels that, but not really. And now a third of all internet downloads are pornographic.
Right.
There are no parameters for our kids. So that's why it's so important, especially, to start early on this thing and teach our kids, this is what is true. This is what is right. This is what we believe as a family. And we're just, there's so much garbage out there. There's so many narratives in this world where it's like up is down, down is up, right is left, and horrible ones, truth about law enforcement too. It's just backwards and wrong. And so to be able to kind of take a minute and reassess, like, how much information is coming in as our young kids are formulating these worldviews. We have this tremendous privilege of being the ones to help teach them what is true and what is not true, and right and wrong. And so we got to seize those years. Some of my favorite parenting authors, Clay and Sally Clarkson, they've observed over teaching parenting classes for years and years that the most powerful window of influence parents have are between the kids ages 4 to 14. And so they were saying, you really got to, seize that window and really tune in with your kids. And unfortunately, those kids are getting so much digital entertainment. They're being shaped and influenced, those worldviews, by whoever is on the other side of that device. But it's time, if you want to take that back, I want to help you do that as parents. So that's really why I wrote the book.
That's awesome. Very powerful. When you use the word detox, you're not for those first 2 weeks, you're not simply talking cutting back. You mean a detox. In other words, to go without. Is that correct?
That's correct.
How important is that? Because I'm sure I'm sure somebody is listening to this and is like, yeah, well, I just cut back on this. Or if they just do an hour less, that's going to work. Or if it's the same end result, especially since after the 2 weeks, or for whatever it becomes for that person, they're going to decide to bring something back in. Well, I'm just skipping that middle step. I'm just getting to the end goal. How important is the actual detox portion?
Yeah, it is critical, especially for your youngest kids, because these are kids who need to practice the art of hitting that boredom wall and negotiating their own boredom. These are kids who are, their creativity is just waiting to explode. But if they know, if I ask for screen time, if I hit that boredom wall and I ask, can I use my screen time? And the answer is yes, what are they not getting to experience? What are they not creating? And we know that there's actually a pruning that happens in those neural pathways of the brain, both in like early childhood around 4 and 5, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, and then also in the teen years, where if the connections aren't used, they're lost. So if whatever our kids are practicing a lot for several hours a day, they will get better at those things. And whatever they're not doing, the ability to, there's a reason, you think about how foreign languages are easier for young kids to learn. You've probably heard that.
Oh, yeah.
And it's the same for other things. So if our teenagers are practicing classical piano for several hours a day, they're going to be phenomenal at that. If they're practicing lots of gaming and social media, that's what they're training their brains to do. So yes, I recommend cold turkey. You're really giving your kids so much more than you're taking away, because what you're giving them is opportunities to learn a skill, a talent, an interest they have. And ultimately, the hope is that they continue to hone those things. They go out into the world and they're blessing the people around them with those things, rather than turning inward and creating this world where they're just accommodating self. It's all about me. It's all about, how do I make this perfect little pod where I'm entertained and I'm numbed out? And if I'm bored, then I'm going to, versus sending, what are you good at? Oh, you like to bake. Wow, you can bless the neighbor with that. We need this human connection, and our kids, if we're numbing them out, they're not going to get that.
Yeah. Powerful. And one of the things I want to point out to what you're saying right there that you state in the book, it's not about solely taking away. In fact, really, it's the opposite. It's going over in fact, you have a lot of great resources in the book. That's why everybody needs to get it. That talks about things you can do to fill that time and interests the kids might have. And a lot of it's all split up to being age appropriate and so forth, correct?
Absolutely. Yeah. I want to make this very accessible for parents. I know we've probably all seen those like Pinterest accounts and fancy craft boxes and all these things, all these like organized pantries and craft cupboards that we think, okay, if I'm taking away the screens, then I better be like that. No, you do not have to be like any sort of type of parent in order to fuel your kids' screen-free interests. Like I'm a person of faith. I believe that God paired you with your child on purpose. He paired your unique giftings with their unique needs and giftings, and you are exactly the person to help them through this day and age with the digital entertainment up to our eyeballs. You are there to meet them where they're at and help study them and feed those interests and help cultivate them. Now, one thing I want to dispel really quick, some parents will say, well, gosh, I'm busy. I get home from work. I'm exhausted. Like I use this as to give me a break. I need a break. Parents, 100% you need a break. Like this is not helicopter parenting. This is not like entertain your kids all day. In fact, we actually enjoyed more breaks as parents, my husband and I, this blew our minds after our detox than we did before. And the reason for that is once your kids learn to and practice the art of negotiating their boredom and creating and imagining, those things will grow in them. Their attention spans get bigger. Their interests expand. They learn how to troubleshoot and work together as friends, as neighbors, as siblings. And so those periods of time that you get, they grow those breaks. So while on the front end, their attention spans might be dinky small because they've been numbed out. They haven't had to practice. Because you look at your kids, a lot of parents will look at their kids and say, look at him focusing on his iPad. Look at that focus. It's teaching him to pay attention. That is not true. That is the look of overstimulation. You're actually degrading their ability to sustain attention. So even if the first couple days of that detox period are difficult, you're giving them skills that they're going to use for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, no, and I love in the myth section that you have where you point out a lot of these things. That's a lot of that is powerful because it is exactly the opposite of what you always think and what you always heard. Because I've heard exactly that same thing. Oh, well, it's focus. But it's like, well, then why is this focus not actually applying to anything other than devices? That doesn't logically make sense to me. To that end, another thing you bring up that I think is really missing and part of why I'm bringing it up, and I love one of the quotes you have in there. That's also why I'm going there. So you have this acronym, Undo the Tech Trance, which the listeners are going to have to get the book, Digital Detox, the 2-week reset for kids in order to know the entire acronym. But the O is open the books. And I like how you kind of get back to this idea of reading because I really think it's missing. And there's a quote in there that says, a child who doesn't enjoy books is a child who has not met his genre. And as an avid reader myself and one who participated in the library contest every summer growing up, because there was nothing else to do, it was either going to be sports. I grew up in Indiana, so you were going to either play basketball at the park, which you did all the time, and then you read. Like that's literally the things that I primarily did. So can you comment just a little bit on reading and how that is an important component of this?
Absolutely. I am a convert to this idea that you can create a bookworm out of any child. I used to think some kids enjoy reading for pleasure and some kids don't. And that's just the way it is. But I promise you, you can make a bookworm out of any kid. I know I have 6 kids. Some of them will read whatever book you hand them. Some of them, it takes work to get these kids to matchmake, to figure out what is their genre. One of my kiddos, during our detox, I went to the library like 3 or 4 times. I'm like, what are you into? Let's try this book. Your sibling loves this. No, wasn't into it. Okay, tried another one over and over. And it wasn't until we got children's nonfiction books about like facts or joke books, because this kid's attention span was dinky tiny. And those joke books, those fact books, really helped him see, gosh, I get gratification out of like 2 lines. Or if I read this and share this joke with someone, like, that's pretty cool. I've shared something fun with them. They enjoy it. And then we can build from there. So when still to this day, it takes a little bit of work, but I'll sit down if I'm trying to stretch a kid into the next kind of reading level. I'll get a book that we know is good from the library and we'll read it aloud together, taking turns. And now you're taking the work out for them where they don't have to sound out the words. They don't have to focus so hard. They just get to enjoy the story. And the benefits of this it's really hard to overstate. This isn't also like extra difficult for parents. I find that reading aloud to my kids is perfect for when I'm out of, coherent thoughts or really great lessons to impart on my kids. It's like, all you have to do is give them a snack so their mouths are full and you read a great story to them and they're calming down and you're sharing like a home culture, a great moral to whatever story you've chosen. And there's a lot of really quality books. I have several recommendations in the book too, for you to get reluctant readers hooked on books. I've seen this transform older kids too, kids from foster care, foster teens we've had in our home, just taking them to the library, sitting with them, talking about these stories, they get sucked into these books and it builds empathy in our kids. It helps them put their feet in someone else's shoes. One of my favorites is A Long Walk to Water. It's about this kid in Africa who, it's very short, it's like 100 pages, who has to walk like 6 hours a day barefoot to get water for their family. And it's like, my kids, he prayed at dinner one night. My 9-year-old was like, wow, Lord, thank you for this food. And thank you that I don't have to walk barefoot to get water for my family. And I'm like, what? This is such a win. This is awesome. Like, just showing them like different people live differently and getting outside yourself. So there's so many benefits and it's accessible. It's not those like homeschool Pollyanna families only. Like this is accessible to every family.
And that's a point in fact, we're not going to get to all the questions I have on that because it really does drive that point home. A couple of things that I really like is not only the idea of reading to your kids and so forth, but even you talk about when you bring tech back in, things you can do together, like movie night, maybe playing Mario Kart as a family, those kind of things. So it really is the opposite of taking something away. It's really, you hear it all the time and you hear it in the Christian community, you hear it in just right now society as a whole. Well, we've gotten away from the family. We've gotten away from, we just don't spend time together at the dinner table. Well, these are ways that we're bringing that back in some sense. Maybe it isn't dinner at 5 with, with all the maybe idealistic trappings that one might want, but this is a way that you're starting to bring that family time back together, which is the core of it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's giving you those in-between moments back. Which is exactly what we found where those are the building blocks of family. It's relationship. It's face-to-face conversation. It's showing our kids they're fully known and fully loved by their mom or their dad. And that doesn't change. That doesn't change if they're going through an awkward phase, if they got acne and, whatever's going on. Even on their worst days, their parents are with them. They love them. And when the device is gone, I'll tell you, my kitchen, when I'm making dinner, it fills up. Kids kind of just trickle in there. And after a couple minutes of quiet, the real stuff on their heart will pour out. Like, hey, this thing happened at school. Or, hey, how's this? Like, do you think this joke is funny? And it's those things that are kind of tangled up in their minds and their hearts that they're kind of bringing that to mom and dad. And that's where we want them to bring it. So many kids today are just numbing out instead of processing their junk. And I think that's a huge component behind the mental health crisis we're in. So we have this tremendous opportunity to parent our kids at this time. And we don't have to wring our hands. We just got to roll up our sleeves. It's very simple.
No, it's very powerful. And I think it's not just kids, it's adults as well when we talk about this processing side. One last question along this line that I want to ask you, because I know that somebody listening, there's going to be a little bit of kickback or angst around. Do you think parents need to participate in the detox as well?
That's a great question. It's probably the one I get asked most often. And I'm going to be honest with you, when we did our detox, our kids were 10 and under. My husband and I did not participate. Now that said, I wasn't scrolling on Instagram while my kids were staring at me. That would have been not cool. But at after they went to bed, at the end of the day, my husband and I would watch our show that we like to watch at the end of the day. So, gauge it. Now that said, if your kids are tweens or teens, you're going to need to choose at least one aspect of your tech use tech entertainment, and you're going to need to detox alongside your kids because they care so much more about what we do than what we say. As they get older, they're watching us. So I do recommend picking something, detoxing it with your kids, but you don't have to. If your kids are young, you don't have to, although I trust you as a grown-up to be mindful. Also, the last chapter in the book is about tech for mom and dad. If you do want to detox yourself, there are ways to modify it so that it's working for you. I did it with my friend. So anyway, that's in there too.
Yes, it is. And there's a lot of good resources there. The other thing I want you to tell us a little bit about is what else they can find on the website. It looks like there is a quiz at mollydefrank.com. Can you just tell us a little bit about the website and kind of what people can expect to find?
Yeah, absolutely. Tons of free stuff on there. There is a quiz if you want to get started, but you're not sure how to start. Take the quiz on my website, mollydefrank.com. There's also a lot of free stuff. So like 100 free ideas for screen-free fun for your kids. You can go download those. There's also, when you order the book, a bunch of other freebies you'll get access to, like how to convince a skeptical spouse to do a digital detox. So that's a common problem for parents. They're like, I listened to this podcast. I want to do it. My spouse is not into it. Well, print this PDF, hand it over, save yourself the marital strife. Let me at them. And then another freebie is tech-free table topics, 14 of them, one for every single night of your detox. Lots of other kind of fun freebie stuff for you on there, mollydefrank.com.
That's awesome. They definitely, I suggest everybody check that out. If you are a parent of kids, young kids, even older kids. And I will say, obviously my son's an adult now, but I ran it as though he was still an older teenager, and it's great feedback that you get. So I strongly suggest everybody to go to that mollydefrank.com. Molly, what is next for you? What is next for your mission? And what is next after this book?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know what? Right now, I'm just focused on helping families with this. I get really encouraging messages from moms often on Instagram. They'll send me pictures of their kids doing screen-free fun, and they'll say, "I cannot believe this. I heard people say it worked for them, but I didn't think it would work so quickly for me." So right now, I'm still focused on this. But I think long term, my heart is to help equip and encourage families to connect with each other, moms to connect with their kids, dads to connect with their kids. In a world that's increasingly disconnected, parents and families, there's so much power in the home, and parents, we have so much influence on our kids. We gotta use it. We gotta take it back. So yeah, that's me.
Well, I truly believe we can change the country if we get back to this principle of getting back to the family. So
absolutely.
Very, very powerful, Molly. Thank you. I've got one final question for you before I let you go, because I ask everybody this question. So I have to ask you as well. What is the one takeaway, the one thing that law enforcement officers can do in their personal lives that's going to make a difference in their personal lives?
Ooh, go home and love your kids.
I love it. Very simple. How can everyone connect with you?
mollydefrank.com. You could find me there. You can find me on Instagram. I love sharing tips on there. And yeah, those are the best ways.
Perfect. I'll have that all linked up in the show notes. Thanks again, Molly. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks, Wayne.
So thank you for watching or listening to this week's podcast. Every episode has full show notes with all the links, pictures, transcription of every episode. It's all available at the website ontheblueline.com/show notes, or you can do it the easy way and just click the link that's in the show notes on whatever platform you're watching or listening to this on, and it will take you straight to the show notes page for every episode. That is all for today. Don't forget that I will see you next Monday in Morning Roll Call. I will see you next Thursday in the interview room. But in the meantime, I'm going to see you out there on the Blue Line.